team that comprises my colleague Karen Burnett, who's on the call too, and Evelyn Chalk, who looks after Scotland, and Edward Bellamy, who looks after our work with NHS Digital, and together we report into Susie Foster, who's our CEO. Thank you very much for joining this session on digitisation, and the purpose of this session is really to think about the experience that we've had as we've embarked on digitisation programs with our customers, and for us all to share reflections on what went well, what could have gone better, some lessons to learn, some things to think about. So before I kick off, just a little bit of housekeeping. This is a live session. I think there are a couple of hundred people on here, so we're not going to go around and ask everybody to say their names. We'll all introduce ourselves just in a couple of minutes. It's a live session, high number of attendees, so the microphones are off. So we really would welcome any questions, and there's a little Q&A button with a question mark in the top right hand corner of your screen. So if you put anything in there, we've got somebody who's sitting by to moderate those questions, and they'll ask them on your behalf to the panel. If we don't get round all of them, then we'll drop a note around separately afterwards, those we didn't get to do, but we'll do our best to get through as many as we can. This session will be recorded so that you can share it with colleagues after the event. So let's talk a little bit about digitising patient records. And to help me with this, I have Edward Claude Baker, who is a GP and part of our clinical team. I have Karen, who I've already mentioned, and Paul Hammil, who is the product owner within EMIS for patient records. So you've got a broad brush of experience from the clinical to the operational to people who've got involved in helping our customers write business cases for change and getting into some of the detail of deployments. So it's great that you all attended this thing online. We were really hoping to have our own session in Leicester, and some of you may already have been aware that we were going to use the Space Museum there, which is a fantastic place if you've never been, and hopefully we'll get there next year. But COVID has really turned the world upside down, and so before we start, just a second, just to pay tribute to everything that everybody's done, not just in the clinical industry, but in the technical industry too. I know some of you on this call have been working some extremely long hours under a lot of pressure, and I think a collective round of applause to everybody for the work that's been done. So this is my 30th year in health technology. No, I hear you say. Started in 1991 in North Lincs and Goole Hospital, and I worked in HR for a little while. And one of my patches was medical records, and that really taught me the value of those clinical paper records that sat in a huge warehouse-like facility in Grimsby, where I lived, and in fact still live. And the challenges in keeping those records up to date, but more importantly, extracting the knowledge that's in them and putting it in the hands of clinicians so that good clinical decisions can be made in full possession of the facts. And often that data needs to be made available under a great deal of pressure and in a very, very timely way. And that experience of working with the medical records team taught me a lot. And it then reflected when I went to do my postgraduate in natural language processing, and I worked on mental health research programs when I worked at Walkergate Hospital up in Newcastle. And the value of the data that's held, particularly in very in longitudinal mental health records, was immense, not just for clinical care, but also for research. And then my third experience was working in NHS estates, where the narrative was all about space, capacity, storage, cost of retrieval. How do you make sure that you manage patient data in the most secure way? And how do you take advantage of all the technology that's available to enable you to digitize records? So why digitize patient records? Well, I've already touched on the importance of the knowledge that's held in these records to improve the safety of care for patients, not least by providing access to a full patient record at point of care. And particularly my experience in mental health was that large volumes of case notes going back a long time can be very difficult to read and to extract the true and the important meaning from them that's required at a moment in time when you're in a clinical consultation. And whatever clinical setting you operate in, speed is really important, isn't it? It's really important to be able to get to the truth of the matter really, really quickly. And I talked a little bit about the administrative overhead in maintaining paper records. And so there's a lot of impetus behind this. As we all know, there are a set of contractual commitments to digitize records, as well as the push from commissioners, for all the reasons I've just described, to try and digitize records, because it's generally a good idea, and it's a huge job. So if you're thinking about the typical number of Lloyd George wallets in a typical practice, and then the amount of records that may contain, that's quite a lot of work. And there are some legislative things as well about needing to keep the Lloyd George wallets, because they are required to be retained by law. So there's some governance around the digitisation process that you need to think about. And I'm guessing that many of you on the call will either be approaching a situation where you have to understand these things because you're making a business case to change, or these things were part of your business case for change, and you need to deliver on them as part of projects that you're involved in. Edward, I just want to come to you for a moment, and just from a GP's perspective, what do you see as the key benefits of digitising records?
Thank you, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Edward Clobaker. I'm a clinical director for EMIS Health and a GP in Leicestershire. I've been working there for about 20 years now. So the patient's recent medical record is instantly available on the computer to us at the point of care, unlike the contents of the Lloyd George envelope. But we still need that to check historic diagnoses, previous investigations, treatment that a patient may have had, or perhaps allergies. So we still need access to these historic records. The manual filing of these records is very time consuming, and as is the sending and receiving of the Lloyd George wallet as patients join or leave a practice. Practice staff spend much time looking for these, bundling them up, sending them off, and sometimes if you need the record, they can spend a considerable amount of time and come back and say, we've looked everywhere for it, but we just can't find it. Not an uncommon scenario. If your records are stored off-site, there's a cost to that and a time delay to get access to the Lloyd George. But then by contrast, if you store the records on site, that usually takes up premium ground floor space due to the weight of all of these records. And at a time when many practices have been struggling for consulting room space, especially downstairs, this space that the Lloyd George records takes up is of premium value. So, and when a patient leaves your practice and moves to another practice, it's ideal that the whole record goes through the GP to GP process. So if the Lloyd George is digitized, then it will be included in that process, which will be excellent. I think importantly to say, we've actually got a GP contract commitment to do this project by March 2023. And this is a superb opportunity for general practice and a real transformative measure. And as I look back over my 20 years, there have been things that have happened like electronic prescriptions, and right up there in that sort of transformation of general practice as we move forwards will be that digitisation of the Lloyd George.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Edward. So we've made our case for change, and we've thought about what we're going to do, and now we're into where are the potential gotchas and the big rocks of issues that you need to consider as you undertake a digitisation project. So it's important to say that we're a couple of slides in here, and I've not really mentioned EMIS, and that's kind of deliberate. These are generic issues that you need to think about, whatever vendor you choose to use and whatever process you choose to follow. So there are four real things that you need to think about in terms of doing a digitisation project in a safe way. And really they fall under the general heading of creating an unbroken chain of custody. So they're about how do you make sure that the integrity of the data is protected at all times as it goes through a process of leaving your practice, going to a scanning agency, maybe going somewhere else, and then being uploaded back into the clinical record, and making sure that all the way through the data that you need isn't lost, doesn't become jumbled up, doesn't become spread across different patients' records. You're handling duplication of records in the right way. So assuring yourself that you've got data integrity, humbly suggest should be one of the key steps that you consider as you go through the process. And as you think about who your partner's going to be as you go on that journey, then there are a set of quality standards that you could ask for to give yourself comfort that that issue's been taken into account. Your Lloyd George records will leave your premises and they will need to be securely stored somewhere and scanned somewhere. So many scanning vendors go to a great deal of trouble to make sure that they can demonstrate to you that they comply with particular BSI standards, and often will offer an inspection so you can have a walk round and look at what happens to those records while they're out of your site, so you can be assured that they're being handled in a safe way. It's not just the facilities that those records are stored in, it's who's actually handling them. And so this isn't like loading a photocopier and just generating some output from the other side that might be my shopping list for eBay for the month. These are really important clinical records that have all kinds of governance and controls that need to be applied to them, and you need to be assured that you've got registered data handlers looking after those records so that you can be assured they'll handle them in a safe way, but also you can make sure that you comply with NHS standards on quality management and information security should you be audited or should, God forbid, anything go wrong. So it's really important you think about not just where that data is stored, but who's got access to it and what they're doing with it, so you can make sure that's been done in a safe way. And of course, across all of that, then end-to-end tracking and traceability is really important. It's important you know where that box is at a particular time and you can get access to it whenever you want, and that the whole cycle of digitizing your records has been concluded really safely with the issuance of a destruction certification, so that you can demonstrate that those records that have been scanned have indeed been disposed of in the right way. And of course, you need your Lloyd George envelopes back, although I gather there's some discussion about whether they can be declassified as an official document in some way, because it's if your business case is based on reducing storage, then you're not actually getting rid of all of your paper, you're keeping the blank envelope. Edward, I'm going to come back to you again. I think I've covered at a high level the 4 key issues. What's your perspective on that as a GP?
Yeah, so as a GP practice, we're the custodian for the Lloyd George wallets and their contents, and we're the data controller for the GP medical record. And it's very important to remember this is special category data. It's confidential medical information. So it must be treated very, very carefully. So as a GP, if I was going through this digitization process, there are a number of things really from end to end that I'd want to be reassuring myself were all in place. And some of these would include, have all the people in the chain of events end to end in this digitization process been through the necessary background checks, such as disclosure and barring service? Are all the international standards and British standards in the process being met? At my end in the surgery, I'd need to be absolutely sure that the correct patient information is in the correct Lloyd George record. So whatever I give in is what I will get back in a digital format. Everything is going to be uploaded. Security of the Lloyd George is paramount from end to end, including the boxing up of the records collection, the secure tracked vehicle transport, and the scanning, data checking, upload into the medical record, destruction of the physical Lloyd George contents, and indeed the duplicate digital Lloyd George at the scanning centre. So I'll need to assure myself quantitatively and qualitatively along the way. So quantitatively, did I get all my records back in a digital format that I gave in a physical format? And qualitatively, are they all complete? Are they readable? Does optical character recognition work? Does text searching work? Is the resolution good enough? Was the dots per inch the DPI of adequate resolution? Because the quality that you scan now will determine the future use of those records. Was the correct file format used? Has the record been indexed properly? Can redaction software be applied to this document in case a patient wants to have access to part of it? And I need to be sure about the destruction of the physical Lloyd George. Is that going to a secure facility? The record might be incinerated, pulped, or cross-shredded, but I need to be certain of that and make sure I've got a certificate of destruction for the contents of the Lloyd George. We'll need to have a full audit trail of events from end to end. I've also got to think, do I want one contract for this whole process? In other words, a fully managed secure service, or am I going to have multiple contracts in this process, perhaps scanning and uploading being two examples? But I need to be sure there are no gaps in the middle and that I have an unbroken chain of custody.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. So we've alluded to the process and I'm guessing you've either got or you'll come up with a project plan for your digitisation project that look a bit like this at a high level. And these are the sort of 7 swim lanes, if you like, that you'd expect to see in any digitisation plan. And each of them takes an amount of time. There's a clear critical path and there are a set of issues to consider in each of these boxes. But essentially, it's a well-trodden path, isn't it, of packing your records, boxing them, delivered via secure courier with vehicle tracking, so you know where those records are, to somewhere they're then scanned. The bit in dark blue is the bit that you need to think a little bit more about, because people are approaching this in different ways. So, you know, do you want your Lloyd George notes uploaded to your GP system, whether it's ours or somebody else's, as a clinically coded attachment? You know, you've got to think, is this about just scanning, or is this about a digital transformation? Is it about trying to address some of those challenges that we put up in the very first slide about making information available at point of care in the clearest way and the most usable way, so embedded in GP workflow, embedded in a clinical system so it's highly visible and digitized and made available so that you can harvest whatever knowledge might be contained in the record? And then you're back into the lighter blue coloured ones about the written authority to destroy and your paper notes securely being destroyed 60 days after receipt of authority. So I'm sure most of you will have a plan like this, but just jumping out to the bit in dark blue. So Edward, I'm going to ask you a slightly tongue-in-cheek question here. So digitisation, Edward, it's just about scanning, isn't it?
No, I think we really need to upload this document to the patient's electronic record. So just as with their recent consultations, letters, investigations, which are on their electronic medical record, I think the historic Lloyd George content should be there as well. Then they're instantly accessible to me within the patient context, and I'm not then having to manage a separate login and therefore the maintenance of a separate computer system to access this document, which alongside with that may have cloud storage charges and security concerns that all need to be maintained. The logical place to put the Lloyd George record is in the patient's electronic record. And importantly, if the patient does leave you, your practice, and move to another practice, whether that be nearby or far away, the Lloyd George can travel in the GP to GP process. That's particularly important if the patient moves far away, because if you imagined perhaps a patient moving from Sheffield to Devon, if they were using different portal providers, how would the GP at the new surgery have access to that Lloyd George, which was in a different portal provider's domain? I think just one important point to mention here, when you do upload the record, the Lloyd George record to the patient's medical record, it should not be visible through patient-facing services by default. And by that I mean if they log on to Patient Access or the NHS app and look at their documents, they can't access their Lloyd George record. That specific permission has to be given to enable that to happen.
Thanks for that, Edward. I'm just going to go off piece a little bit. So as you might expect, dear listener, we had a set of scripted questions between Edward and I to make the conversation flow. But here's a little curveball for you then. Edward, can you say a little bit more about what should be made available through patient-facing services and how we might think about what, from a GP's perspective, what information should be shared with a patient and in what way?
Yeah, so I'm a huge fan of opening up records to patients. It's that shared commitment and both of us having access to the record. I think people have been a little bit more careful about what they're writing in the records, bearing in mind patients may read that and question us about what we wrote and the tone in which it was written. So I personally am very keen that patients should have access to investigations, documents, their problem list, medication, allergies, booking of appointments. And this is one of those documents which forms part of that. Generally speaking, I would tend to do it prospectively. In other words, if the patient applies for permission from now, I would do it going forwards. There may be some circumstances when you want to go retrospectively with some aspects of that, such as documents, investigations and consultations, but generally I do that prospectively. And I think about when you think about patients who've got long-term conditions, that's such as rheumatoid arthritis on disease-modifying drugs that require regular monitoring, that shared ownership of results and what's happening can be so useful. If you work with your patients to make sure they understand what the results mean, for example, then that can really help in terms of the long-term medication management. And of course, remember that many patients are sent copies of hospital letters now anyway in a paper form, so you're really just giving them access to that electronically. This could be very helpful actually if you needed to share the record as a patient because you'd been admitted to hospital or you were going through some medical investigations and wanted to share your GP record. So that can be very helpful, having all of these facilities available through your patient-facing service provider.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Edward. I think it was worth spending a couple of minutes just thinking about that, about what you do with the scanned document, how you embed it in clinical workflow, and also what the implications might be for your patients and your relationship with your patients, and where there are opportunities to share information, how that might benefit the whole clinical process. So just to summarise what we've talked about, using an upload service is quite an important thing to consider if you want to make sure you unlock the full benefits of digitisation. So converting paper notes to coded records it is really important, and there are benefits for that. Having them in your clinical system, having them having the ability to edit them quickly, update them, search them, annotate them, so that they're really embedded in the way that you normally want to work as a GP is important, and you have the opportunity to get that benefit if you think about your digitisation project with that endpoint in mind. And because of the complexity of the chain of custody, the supply chain, the different moving parts in the digitisation programme, one of the things that you might want to think about is how you organise your supply chain, whether you were to use us or anybody else. A dedicated program implementation team that looks after the whole process has been proven to be of significant benefit in de-risking the process and making sure it happens more quickly and effectively. So that's my kind of 4 lessons from that little piece on the upload service. So we're going to have a little chat about what your practices might ask. First of all, before we do that though, I'm going to introduce my colleague Karen. Karen, talk to us a bit about what the issues, what issues you need to consider when embarking on a digitisation programme, based on your experience of running a couple of these in the London area?
Thanks, Paul, and good afternoon, everybody. My slight glib answer, Paul, could be everything you've already talked about, because it's all very important. But I think the best way to answer the question is to reflect on what customers that I've worked with, as you've already mentioned, have benefited most from, and that's been talking to other customers that have embarked on this. There are some very good success stories out there. Equally, there are examples of when it hasn't worked very well. What they've also learned is prep is absolutely key. As you've already said, this is a volume task, and therefore the more prep you do, the easier it is to make a success of the whole programme. Security and risk always come high up on the agenda. Have they been mitigated? Are they going to be managed? Is the partner that you're working with able to give you an absolute concrete, yes, this will be absolutely fine? Project management. I know often it can be perceived as an expensive requirement, but actually for a volume involving a lot of practices that have different needs. There is not a one size fits all for every practice here. Some will have resource available to pack, some won't, so a pre-packing service by your partner is valuable. So again, it's thinking about, have you got some flexibility in the partner that you're working with to accommodate all those different needs? And I'm very conscious, Paul, I could go on and on and on, but I'll leave it there unless you want to throw me a curveball.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you, Karen.
Pleasure.
Some of the things that we've been talking about so far are things that you're going to put on your issue and risk log as you think about planning out your programme. And so, you know, as Karen was talking, here's a wee aid memoir of the sorts of issues that practices may raise with you that you could think about. So, you know, questions about how the box is packed and collected. So, you know, some programs rely on the practices to do that themselves, others buy that service in. Advantages and disadvantages of each needs to be approached in a slightly different way, but they're things you kind of need to plan for. For us, for where we're engaged with practices, how you get the upload into EMIS Web is obviously quite an important issue. So if you decide that you want to upload your scanned documents into your clinical system, then how those records get in there is a heavily nuanced process. Each clinical system will be different. The upload process will be different. Your scanning vendor might have a different way of approaching it, including the scanning vendors, of course, that we work with in EMIS. So getting it straight in your mind, how the records get uploaded into your clinical system, will be one of the issues that you'll have to think about in quite a bit of detail. Why do we have to keep Lloyd George wallets is a question that you'll be asked. Currently, that's a legislative requirement that may change in future, but it's something you need to keep abreast of. The checking the records have been scanned and uploaded. You know, there are a set of responsibilities for everybody in the process, including the practices. And the important outcome you've got to achieve is to be satisfied that the scans and uploads have been completed as they were expected to be. And going back to my 4 points about information governance and security earlier on in the presentation. So you've got to figure out who's going to do what, who's going to take what responsibility in that way. What happens to records after they're scanned? So in your practice, you've got your data back, it's uploaded in your clinical system and you're happily working on it. How can you be assured that those records have been disposed of in the right way? And equally, how can you make sure that the electronic versions of the records you've got are working for you in your practice in the way that you wanted? Where are the files stored? So my experience of the organisations I've worked with is that they tend to like to go and have a look around the scanning and storage facilities just to be assured that they are appropriate. You might not want to do that. You might just check the certification and accreditations that your scanning vendor's got, but you will need to be assured around that. And certainly if you're providing this service to practices, so if you're a commissioning support unit or if you're buying this as a CCG on behalf of practices, your practices will want to be assured on that. And there are a number of steps that you could take, some of which we talked about in this presentation so far. And then the biggie, how much extra work will this be for the practice? So I'm guessing that if I was looking across the floor, well, I would hope that I would see lots of people nodding at most of the things that we've said about why this is a good idea. But nevertheless, it is a project, it's a piece of work, requires some resourcing, needs to be fitted in around other things that you do, and that can be quite a challenge for people. And going back to how a box is packed and collected, you know, one of the ways you can mitigate that challenge is to outsource the box packing. So there are lots of questions that your practices will ask, or you will ask if you are in a practice, and they need to be planned out in a way that I've just described. So I'm going to come on to a detail of what a plan looks like. So this is a template plan that you're welcome to use. You could copy and paste the EMIS for something else. It's a fairly generic process. But what we've done is coloured it in by talking about how we would approach it in EMIS land, having spent quite a bit of time reflecting on the experience that our customers have had and refining and redesigning the process. So I don't want to suggest that this is that we are in some way the arbiters of good taste on this. What we're doing is humbly offering a plan to you all to get you thinking about what you need to do, how you might organise it, where some of the issues might be, the sequence of events, and how long some things might take. So what I'm going to do is hand over to my friend and colleague Paul Hammil. So you have two Paul H's on the call, and for those of you who are watching online, I'm young Paul H. This is old Paul H, who is older, wiser, and much more experienced. So, Mr. Hammil, could you take us through what a typical digitisation plan might look like?
Thank you, Paul, the young pretender. And good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me and understand me, more importantly. A typical digitisation plan, well, as you mentioned earlier, this is a fairly well-trodden path for us. But we realise that although we've done it many, many times, for each practice, it is their first and only time. We have a dedicated team of people. They've been trained and they're well experienced in stepping through a structured and tested plan. And they remain in regular contact throughout each step. That keeps the practice well informed, especially as there are many checkpoints throughout as well. It all begins in the preparation stage with the pre-engagement activities. We're establishing points of contact on both sides and making sure we have the details right. Then they'll talk it through and explain how everything works throughout each step. We set an outline timeline as well. Now, this depends largely on the patient list size, because as you said, there is no one size fits all. But the checkpoints are the same pretty well throughout. We also look to define any other planned commitments that there may be, for example, refurbishments, limitations whereby files are held on a first floor and there's no lift and you've got to use the stairs, and just to understand any other practical limitations. The boxing and cataloguing is one of the big areas that can impact upon the practice. Again, the number of the boxes is determined by the list size, the patient list size. We work this out through a formula and send out the boxes to the practice for them to fill out, unless of course we're using the packing service, which is slightly, it follows the same pattern, but is slightly different, in which our team would do it. There is the time needed for boxing is agreed, usually worked on again by experience, and the schedule is determined by the workload. As I said, there will be many practices boxing, cataloguing, and having their records scanned concurrently. We work on the collection. Our deployment team work on the collection date. It's agreed. It's scheduled well in advance. It'll be checked more than once by the project manager. After collection, the boxes are taken straight to the scanning center. There's no stopping, no passing go. They go straight there. then into the scanning operation, where it also has been scheduled according to the existing commitments. And of course, we know in advance what the patient list size is, so we know how many boxes were coming in. And as you said earlier, we know how many boxes. Everyone knows which box contains which files and which patients' files are tracked right throughout from end to end. Now, after scanning, the scanned records, the files are transferred back to the practice to a named contact, GDPR, of course. And that's really for the checking and the acceptance and validation of what we've done. Now, people sometimes say, how many files should we check through on this? And we're working with NHSX on that, as there are some British standards on the guidance on quality and checking. And once the checking stage is complete, we then move into the upload. We won't do that until we've got the go-ahead from the practice. The upload is direct into EMIS Web. It is attached to the patient's medical record. It's viewable in documents and in clinical event and care history. It goes up with as a read-coded or SNOMED-coded file. The date the record is scanned is there. It is, as Ed said earlier, it's not visible to patient-facing services. And on completion, there will be an exceptions report produced and sent to the practice. So scan files are then accessible to users, to clinicians the next morning. With that in place, they can continue and check again to make sure they're happy that they've got everything that they should have got. The empty LGs are returned to the practice, and nobody wants these, but that's the way it is. I think we'd all like to just destroy them, but until we get the green light on that and the Minister for Health changes things, we can't. The destruction process that we mentioned is the that we refer to as the cross-cut shredding that you'll see quite often. Just want to say it is not actually cross-cut shredding as many people would perceive it, whereby we've got straight cut shredders at home or cross-cut to give a zigzag pattern. The paperwork is actually obliterated, is the best description I can give. There are no straight edges at all. It is torn apart, torn asunder. Even the dust is sucked out of the atmosphere. The paper, the residual outcome that is sent for recycling in 750 kilo bales. There is no coming back once that has been obliterated. And then we will issue a certificate of destruction. We issue that electronically well, we don't need more paperwork. Mm-hmm. And that pretty well concludes it. The regular collection of small batches follows along similar lines. And I think that's about the end-to-end project plan.
Thank you, Paul. That was really helpful. Thanks. There's a few things that come out of that for me. Having been to one of these scanning bureaus, the point about hoovering up the dust, so there's absolutely no way that these records can be reconstructed, is the lengths they go to are absolutely amazing. The other thing that grabs me is the sheer size and scale of the scanning operation and the amount of capital costs that scanners have to outlay to build these great big machines that are capable of chomping through millions of records so very quickly. It's a massively complex endeavor. Just three things that jump out: getting the size estimate right at the start, so you know what scale of challenge you're into, seems pretty important, Paul. Second point about the master manifest list and the checking and reconciliation of the records to that list as they're uploaded into clinical system or received back in the practice or uploaded into cloud storage or whatever your endpoint looks like. And the third thing is the on-demand piece. So while those records are away from the surgery, one of the things that you need to think about in your planning is what provision is there for you to get access to records if you need them really urgently for whatever reason. Edward, before we shuffle off this slide, just from a GP's practice, what's your take on the plan? What are your reflections and things that people might want to look out for?
Well, there's going to be a real sort of balance here of burden of workload and quality of output. And I'd just like to go back to that point Karen made, that preparation is important. And to be quite honest, as a GP, I think practices whose records are in a good state will find this process easier, and the digital output will be more useful to them. Perhaps surgeries that haven't been able to invest as much time in their records management will find it more challenging. So if I'm sort of thinking through this process as a GP, one of the things that's very important is funding. Who is going to pay, or how is this going to be paid for? Can I get some funding through the CCG, or is it centrally available? And that may be something we come back to later in the discussion. I definitely want to talk to some practices who'd been through it, as Karen suggests, find out what went well, what really helped them, and perhaps more importantly, what they would do differently next time. You need a lead point of contact for this project, someone who's going to drive the project and get it through at each practice. For me, two or three really key things with the Lloyd George preparation, which we talked about. One is the summarizing notes. Ideally, you do that before it goes off for scanning. In theory, that should already be in place. The pruning of the contents, as it's known. So Lloyd Georges are pruned, so irrelevant bits of paper are removed, and we keep to what's important. And then, of course, ordering of the contents, because the order in which things are placed into that Lloyd George wallet when you hand it in for scanning is exactly the order in which it will be returned to you in a digital format. So if there was time to prepare in those three areas, that will greatly help a practice with what they get back from scanning. Importantly, the practice will need to undertake a data protection impact assessment, or DPIA, and involve their data protection officer early on in this project. As you say, they'll be running the so-called MML, or master manifest list, which will be very important to run off the definitive record of patients, or list of patients whose records have gone for scanning. We'll need to be thinking about the labeling and packing of boxes. Is that something in my practice want us to be doing, or is that something we want to include as part of the service contract arrangement, so that someone would do that for us, so as not to take people away from their normal duties during the day? We'll have had the inventory list created to correctly align the records actually being sent for scanning, so that's just before they leave the building. We'll have to be thinking about the collection of the records. How are we going to do that? When are we going to do that in terms of disruption to the reception? It is true at this time there are rather fewer patients coming into the building at the moment. After scanning, once the data comes back, we've talked about qualitative and quantitative reconciliation or validation, and I think you're going to be looking at about a 1% record checking, that sort of order of magnitude. Once all of that has happened and the records being uploaded, we'll need to plan for the return for the Lloyd George wallets, which will then have to be kept somewhere securely. And then, as Paul has alluded, there'll be future collections of notes on an ad hoc or regularized basis, depending on what arrangement you put in place. And then after that, perhaps one of the exciting things is, what are we going to do with this space now? So can we get another consulting room out of this? Will we make some more workstations? Will we increase the size of reception? But it might well be, could we get another consulting room? So those are the sorts of things I would want to be thinking about from a practice point of view as we go along in this plan.
That's lovely. Thank you, Edward. I'm going to skip over to to the questions. I think we've had a few posted into the portal, but just to pick up on Edward's point about funding, Karen, I'm going to come to you if I may. How are your customers paying for this? What sort of funding is available to them, and contractual processes can they go through to buy digitisation services?
So some of the CCGs have found the money themselves, because in London property is incredibly expensive, and they've put a business case together in order to get the funding towards the latter end of the financial year. Others, and there are even central pots of funding available based on a business case that we can help customers pull together. But certainly, NHSD are signing off central funding for those that can prove that it will be a key return on investment. So those are the two routes. I mean, it's pay for it yourself or get it centrally, and we've seen both work, because there are definite, significant return on investments. And particularly when you think about social distancing in practices now, space has always been a premium, but never more so as they start to reopen and they need to keep people apart. So those are the two routes I've seen, Paul.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. The other thing I'd add to that is that under the GPIT Futures framework, there's a mechanism for buying digitisation from us and others, if you want to do that. And I gather that there will be a central procurement framework coming out shortly, which will allow you to take advantage of centralised funds to go and get the money you need to start digitisation programmes off. So that's kind of us done in our little 45-minute canter. Karen, are you going to moderate the questions? Have you got them?
I have indeed. So actually, bizarrely enough, Paul, the first one was around funding. So I thought you'd be reading them before me, but anyway. So some specific questions here. First of all, what proportion of records do we recommend practices check before we take boxes away? And Paul Hammil, I think it's a level of detail, having gone through what was a very comprehensive implementation plan, that I'm going to pass to you.
Thank you, Karen. Yes, actually, the British standard on this is being used in NHS. We've been working with NHSX, who now handle the digital transformation programme. They have a table of recommended number of records to check, and it's based around, it doesn't even approach, so in some cases you're talking of a practice size under 2,000, you would be looking at 40 records, going up to over 7,000 patients, would be looking around 80 records is the recommended. Now this isn't finalized, it's still under discussion, but that's the thinking.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Another question around cost. How is the service costed up? Is it according to practice population? And how soon? Well, there's three questions here actually. So, and the final one: how soon can a practice put through a request for digitisation service? And I would suggest that's how you get value for money, by asking three questions in one. So, Paul Henderson, if you can remember them all, can you kick off, and then perhaps bring in your other colleagues?
Sorry, Karen. I'm a man. I'm multitasking. I'm trying to look through the list of questions.
So I'll ask them all at once then. How is the service costed up?
Right. So we cost it based on three elements essentially. There's the preparation stage, the training, the getting you ready. There's the scanning stage, and then there's the upload and validation stage. And in each of those three stages, we have a set of costs that we know are going to be incurred, and we price that up and we send it across to you. And there are some areas where you can get economies of scale. So, there's a whole set of fixed costs associated with with rolling out a training program across the CCG where you've got 50 practices scanning or something, embarking on the program, and you get economies of scale the more you do. Similarly for some of the scanning components of it. So that's essentially how we put the costing together.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, I'll try and find, and by the way, to answer the second part of the question, how soon can a practice put through a request for digitisation service? As soon as this call closes down, please contact me, Paul, or anybody that you've got within EMIS, your account director, and we'll progress accordingly. Right, let me think if I can find something else around. Oh, this is quite a common question. I'm going to put it to Paul Hammil. Can Egton or EMIS deliver digitisation for non-EMIS practices?
Thanks again, Karen. The short answer is yes. What else can I say?
Well,
we have, as Paul alluded to, we have the full service, which is the scan and upload. We have a scan only service, which is fine. Our upload only service is purely for EMIS Web, but we can handle just any practice.
Thank you very much indeed. And again, another important one to all our EMIS Web users: will uploading of all electronic Lloyd George data slow down our EMIS systems? And again, Paul Hammil, I think you're probably best placed to. We'll all have opinions, and Edward might have one, but Paul, perhaps we can hand over to you in the first instance.
Thank you. What we do before we do any upload, we do quite a number of checks. It's quite a protracted internal governance chain. We do the check that first of all, that the physical disk can handle the extra data, because we know what's coming. The database itself is then checked and expanded if it needs to be. And we also check when we're doing the upload that we're not going to interfere with anything like any EMIS Web patching. The fairly recent SNOMED codes that were rolled out, that activity actually required exclusive access to the database, meant that nothing could go against or conflict with it. And we do all this to ensure that there is no adverse impact on the practices. Now, I will, one caveat, there are some software alternatives that people use that I would not recommend. They are dangerous. They don't do any of the pre-checks. They don't check to see if they're going to impact it, even against the operational backups, let alone SNOMED code releases. So when we do it, we're confident we've not had any problems at all.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul.
And I think just to come in there as a clinician,
yes,
you very much want this process carried out end to end, and Paul has already alluded to some of the great detail that has gone to coordinating, for example, software upgrades that GP practices just might not be aware of, or other providers. So it is, you know, the GP's answer is, I really hope it won't slow down my system. But I think I feel very reassured as a clinician hearing that the necessary checks are made to time it correctly, so that we do it at the moment that won't disrupt the system.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm conscious of time, Paul Henderson. I have got a huge number of questions, which is extremely exciting and very positive. I think reflects that people have enjoyed the session. There is an offer from Rene, whose 3 or 4 practices have already been digitised, to share his experience. So I'll make that positive offer now. Rene, thank you very much indeed. So Paul Henderson, perhaps I can pass back to you to wrap up for us all. And for those whose questions we haven't answered, we will collate them all together and we'll make sure that we do respond accordingly. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Karen. So we're approaching the top of the hour. Thanks everybody for bearing with us in this slightly unusual experience of doing this online. Hope it worked for you all, and hope the technology held up for you all. We'll be following up by sending out a digital brochure which summarises the content that we presented to you today and hopefully answers most of your questions. I think we've got a note of all the delegates that joined, and so hopefully with your permission, we will send that out to you, and we'll be in touch. If you've got any further questions, hopefully you will all know who your account managers are. Please refer back to them, and good luck on your digitisation projects, and those of you that have completed them, well done, because it is it's a thing that takes a bit of effort, but the value that you get for clinicians, for patients, for those who look after the operational processes in the NHS, the value is almost immeasurable. And I'd like to thank my panel of colleagues for giving us their GP perspective, Edward, the product perspective, Paul, Karen, the commercial perspective too. So I think hopefully we've given you quite a rounded view of how you might go about projects such as this. So thank you very much, everybody. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and hopefully I'll meet some of you on the road in due course. Thank you.
Bye.